Hello, my name is Naledi Saul, and I'm the director of the Office of Career and Professional Development at the University of California, San Francisco. Welcome to the Strategic Postdoc. This series is based on two questions that my colleague, Dr. Lawrence Clement, and I have puzzled with for several years as career counselors for graduate students and postdocs. One, why do good students choose postdocs that are a bad fit? And two, and more importantly, what are the common realizations and tactics of students who choose strategic postdocs? This session, Acknowledging Preferences, Needs, and Values, is the first part of that answer. Now, you may ask, why is this step important? And why is it first? It may be the case that you haven't actually naturally put your own needs and preferences in the priority position when you've been thinking about your choices, so up until this point. But what you'll see is that it's because your answers will serve as your compass as you navigate the countless decisions that you're about to engage in as you start to move from a student to a postdoc. And it will help you stave off many of the pressures that you'll face throughout this process. Acknowledging your preferences, your needs, and your values helps keep you grounded. So, to understand how this all works, there are four things that I usually need to unpack for students. The first is, what's a strategic postdoc? Secondly, what do we mean when we say good fit versus bad fit? Third, how do you actually start to think about what your preferences, your needs, and your values are? And then fourth, how do you use this information as you start to navigate this path from student to a postdoc? So we're going to tell this story through the lens of three people. The first is Pri, an assistant professor at a research-intensive institution. She's just been given the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to move her lab abroad. The second is the student and postdoc who are in her lab. The student's name is Mia. Mia is a fifth-year biochemistry graduate student who plans to start her own biotech company one day. While she's applying for postdocs this year, she's also considering her options. She's interested in both pursuing a faculty career at a research-intensive institution, but she also might be interested in moving into industry. And then there's Diego. Diego is a second-year neurology postdoc who's interested in pursuing a faculty career at a research-intensive institution, but he realizes that he would like to stay close to his family, and so for that reason, he's decided to actually look for another postdoc. So the first question that students usually have is, what do we mean when we say strategic postdoc? So when we're thinking about what a strategic postdoc is, it is a time-limited training opportunity or a job, and I'll get to that in a minute, designed to set you up for success by developing the relevant knowledge, skills, experience, and connections, and also by giving you the opportunity to achieve a level of productivity sufficient to make you competitive for and successful in whatever job or career path that you want to pursue. The way I sometimes think about it is that when you are sort of looking ahead in time at sort of what your career goals are, and then you stand in this moment and think about the knowledge, the skills, the experience, and the connections that you have and the productivity that you have. What becomes really clear is, what is the gap? The gap is what your postdoc is going to focus on. You are really thinking about the knowledge, the experience, the skills, and the connections that you need to gain, and the productivity that you need to show to be competitive for your career goals. Now, to hear more about sort of thinking about backwards designing your career path, please look at some of our other sessions, including our second session on backwards designing your career, and then also the third one on developing a game plan. But for now, for Mia and for Diego, both of them have an interest in actually pursuing an academic career path. So both of them are going to need to choose a lab where they know that they're going to have the opportunity to demonstrate a certain level of productivity, and that they have a high level of confidence that they're going to be able to negotiate with their PI what they're going to be able to take from the lab. But also for Mia, because she's also interested in both an academic and possibly interested in pursuing an industry career path, she not only is thinking about a postdoc that will position her for that, so she might actually think about a place that has a biotech hub, but at the same time, she's also thinking of selecting a PI where she can actually sort of acknowledge that that is a potential career path for her. So if that's what a strategic postdoc is, and usually students are pretty clear on that, the second part of the question is, what's a good fit versus a bad fit when you're thinking about work? And for that, we go to career development theory, which says that we would all benefit from basically engaging in work that allows us to use our skills, our interests, and our values. Now, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that the very idea that you should be thinking about your career as something where you can derive satisfaction or joy or reflect your values, as compared to, say, just something that offers security or resources, is very much a 20th century concept, and it's not universally held. But someone I respect once said that the goal in life isn't always to put yourself first, but it doesn't make much sense to always put yourself last either. So one of the things I'm going to try to do is convince you that there are several reasons why holding your preferences and your needs and your values dear is going to be critical for you as you start to think about how you're going to make a choice about where you're going to go and how you're going to end up engaging in a great deal of negotiation, both with the PI, both with the lab that you're leaving and with the lab that you're going to. Now, the thing about interest, skills, and values is that it doesn't seem to make as much sense to students as this other concept, which is this idea about thinking about the right content. And when you think about interest, you think about the right content. And that means, what is it that you get to think about all day? Like, in your perfect world, what topics would you be thinking about? What research focus would you be thinking about? What problems would you be thinking about trying to solve? In a perfect world, the good fit would be a place where you get to do work, where you get to think about the things that interest you for most of your day. Now, the skills, that kind of makes sense. Not only do you get to think about what the things that fascinate you all day, but you also get to actually engage in activities that actually feel rewarding to you. So if content is what do you think about all day, skill set is what do you actually do all day. And so for some of you, that actually may be bench research. But for others of you, that may involve careers that span science communication or patent law careers or industry careers, being at the bench or actually in other areas. And so the way that you kind of start to think about it is that when you imagine what a typical day, what a typical week would be like, what do you get to do all day? Now, the third sort of aspect of it, values, is the one that actually students are least familiar with. Because the way that values map is to this idea that says you're in the right environment. And what that means is that you're in a place where you feel that you can do your best work. And what that usually means is about three things. One, that you can show up at work and fully show up at work and engage with the work that you do and with the people that you interact with your definition of integrity. Secondly, that who you are, your goals, your approach, your strengths, your contributions, your work style preferences, your needs, your values, that all of these are not just recognized and welcomed, but they're also rewarded. And then the third part, which is crucial, is that you feel that you're in an environment where you can understand, you can respect, and you can trust the people with whom you work. And so when we think about Mia and Diego, for Mia, that means that this idea about being able to be transparent about both her career goals, either if they're academic or if they're careers beyond the academy, and just her process of exploring that is something that she doesn't necessarily have to hide. What you're hoping to do is not be in a situation where you sort of feel that you have to pretend that you're, say, going to a lab meeting when really you're going to a great sort of alumni event where someone is talking about, basically, for Mia, starting up their own biotech company. So Mia wants to also work in a lab where there's not just sort of great science and there's not just sort of productivity about sort of moving in that direction, but hopefully she's in an environment where not only is there acceptance by her PI, but also there are other people in her lab who also are similarly kind of exploring all of these different options, because they're the people who will actually provide support. And as I said before, both of them, since there is this idea about needing to think about what work you're going to do, what you're going to be expected to achieve, and then also if you're going into a faculty position that ultimately you want to take your work something with you, there's this idea that you feel that you can trust and have a high level of confidence that when the time comes, you will be able to have that conversation with the person who's going to be your postdoc PI. Now, some of the common pitfalls and sort of things that people struggle with is this question, is even sort of just this entire process. That one of the interesting things for a number of people in the sciences is that once you basically said what skill set you were interested in, that you wanted to be a scientist, it's probably likely that the other questions about what kind of work you wanted to do and where you wanted to do it, that actually became secondary, if it was asked at all. And once you moved into this scientific field, right, that a lot of of your path and your goals didn't necessarily prioritize sort of what you personally wanted. It was what you professionally needed to do to basically strategically position yourself. But the idea is that as you move closer and closer to your goals, you hopefully try to find ways to actually make your preferences, not just I need to do a postdoc and I should basically work at a fantastic, at a prestigious institution, but I need to do a postdoc and I should probably kind of try to find an institution that is not only prestigious, but also maybe I should also look at those that are prestigious and actually are supportive. These questions about thinking about where you do your best work and how you do your best work become more important because it's so important that you actually get work done. There's one final point that the idea is that a bad fit is where you're in a situation where you, for example, are in a postdoc lab where you don't get to work on your projects. You don't get to move toward that autonomy. You, in fact, are solely working on the projects of your PI, which might be rewarding and interesting, but don't necessarily position you for your independence. It might be that you're in a lab where perhaps there's certain skills that you wanted to learn, but there's nobody who has the time, even though there's expertise there, to actually kind of give you the time and attention you need to actually help you learn them. And for environment, it is that in some way, shape, or form, you can't bring your full self to work. The way that has actually kind of manifested is anything from the idea that you're in a community, say a city or a state where you sort of feel that you can be safe, where if you are thinking about anything from mental health support or accommodations, that those issues are just as important as things which maybe might feel a little bit sort of personally kind of, well, as my friend would say, twee, which is that you might actually really be thinking about trying to find a lab where it mimics what the experience of your undergraduate lab, not necessarily in terms of the research, but in terms of the environment. So maybe it was a really quiet lab, maybe people actually were incredibly collaborative, and you found that you appreciated those. Those are the things that are part of the support that you need to succeed, which means that those are the things that you should actually try to think about and consider if you're going to have those experiences when you actually move into your new lab. We're going to talk more about that later when we actually explore a little bit about how to interview, not just to make a great impression, but also to assess whether or not the lab would be a good fit for you. Now, once you sort of have a sense of that you need to be in a postdoc that positions you and that you need to be in an environment where it's a good fit, I just want to really take a moment to unpack why thinking about your preferences, your needs, and your values are important. Because sometimes, for some people, that just feels indulgent. That's the only way to sort of describe it. That there's an idea, I think, for a number of people who move into this career path of the sciences, in that there's a sense of sacrifice involved, of hard work, of in some cases going to where the opportunity is, and in some cases trying to sort of think about your own needs or values doesn't necessarily even feel reasonable. But one of the goals as you're kind of moving into from career paths or as you're advancing is to sort of think about where, if anywhere, you can honor what your needs are. And so when we talk about needs, we're talking about things that are essential to your well-being or your productivity in your postdoc. And that can be everything from the type of work that you get to focus on, as we said before, that you're in a lab where you get to actually develop skills that are a good fit for you, or that you're at an institution where there is support for you to even engage in career or professional development activities, to experiences where it's essential that you are at a place where you're near your family or that your partner can get a job. These are things that are, once again, they're essential to your well-being. Those are a little bit different from preferences, but when you think of preferences, you really think about what things you would need because they're beneficial or they're familiar to you, or you feel that they at least contribute to your success. And once again, that's sort of like what kind of like, what's the size of the lab that you feel that you sort of succeed in? What kind of relationship did you have with your PI, and what did you appreciate, or your PhD advisor, and what did you appreciate about that? It might actually be some preferences that have to do with being in a temperate climate, being, as I said before, in your family. For some people, it's a need. For other people, it's a preference. But the way that you kind of separate it is that needs become those things where if you don't have it, it's clear that it is going to sort of affect your either your personal or your professional well-being, while preferences are sort of nice to have. And honestly, all of them ought to at least be in your pocket as you're actually exploring different options. The third is values. And to unpack a little bit about why values matter, you have to sort of understand a little bit about how values are used. When you are leading anything, and so in this case, it would be your PI, values are the principles or the standards that you use when you do four things: when you make decisions, when you communicate, when you manage change, and when you're handling conflict. So you would hopefully not just sort of think about the productivity of the lab, the fundability of how well-funded the lab is, even though those are definitely important, but you also are thinking about the relationship that you are going to be in with your PI and with the other people in your lab. And so you're starting to think about things like, is collegiality, right? Is helping out each other a priority, or something that is is that something that's a value in this lab? Is the opportunity for people to gain new experiences, is that something that is appreciated in this lab? So the reason why that's important is because if that is a value, then people will not only seek out opportunities to do that, but when you do it, you will be recognized for it and you will be rewarded for it. So for example, if, say, engaging in a teaching experience is meaningful to you, even if it wasn't necessarily directly beneficial to your career path. If you were in an environment where the idea was that that your professional development at least should be part of the equation, then you could once again be open about that experience and figure out how to negotiate with your PI to actually have that opportunity. So the way that you kind of think about if you're in a lab or an environment where you're supported is that when you think about the last 5 or 10 kind of things that you wanted to do, or issues or problems that you had, were you in an environment where you feel that people made decisions and they communicated and they handled that change and that conflict in a way that you sort of felt that your needs and your approach was also considered? Like, do you respect their values? Now, one of the other reasons why it's incredibly beneficial for you to actually take the time to think about your needs, your preferences, and your values is that it gives you the chance to appreciate that your PI also has needs, preferences, and values. And in particularly, as you move from student to postdoc, when you are in an experience where you know that you want to end this relationship with possibly the opportunity to take some work or the opportunity to gain some particular experience that sets you up for success, being curious about what your PI's needs and preferences or values are helps you figure out how you're going to negotiate for that. Because the third kind of part, when you're thinking about your needs and you're thinking about this other person's needs, you recognize that they may not overlap, but there's a way that you can actually engage and communicate and negotiate to actually get what you need. Now, one of the other things that I'll just sort of share about sort of just honoring the fact that you have needs, values, and preferences is that there's some organizational management literature that shows that it is highly correlated with motivation. I know that there's lots of language out there about how you ought to be self-motivated, and you should, but there's also just some information and some evidence out there that shows that there's certain factors that actually help support that motivation. And to talk a little bit about what it looks like, there's this beautiful model, which I think people are familiar with, which is the first model, which is a model by Maslow. Abraham Maslow basically was looking at sort of what does a person need to sort of feel that they're safe, that they're whole, that they are, that they're sort of hopefully able to achieve sort of their best life. And Maslow basically figured out that there was a lot of that. It basically ended up being certain foundational things that needed to be in place for you to sort of feel, or not just you, but you, me, everybody, to feel that they can do their best work. Now, in terms of your personal life, that means everything from physiological safety, such as basic survival needs, food, water. There's actually sort of physical safety in terms of feeling that you're safe and protected. There's belonging in terms of friends, affiliation, and relationships. There's self-esteem in terms of feeling competent or confident or feeling a sense of self-worth. And that if you have all of these things, you'll be more likely to achieve your full potential, serving a cause, contributing to a society, meeting your own goals. But what was fascinating is that there's this other guy named Friedrich Herzberg. And Herzberg was really interested in this idea of work. And so he was trying to think about in your professional life, what basically supports you as a person who feels that you can do your best work. So he had the theory that he could map everything that Maslow said, and that it would actually still resonate when we think about the work that we do, not just the lives that we lead. And so, not surprisingly, it did map that for all of us, if we are in an environment where we don't feel that we have enough financial security, if we don't feel confident that our job is secure, it is going to be hard for us to do our best work consistently. If you are in an environment where you don't feel that there are policies or processes in place that protect you, if you don't feel that there is an environment that, say, is supportive, an environment which maybe has bullying or inappropriate behavior, it is going to be hard for you to do your best work. If you do not feel that you have a good relationship, a functional working relationship with the person who is evaluative authority over you, and if you don't feel that you're in an environment that is actually supportive, it is going to be hard for you to do your best work. Once again, particularly as you start to think about being a postdoc, if you are not in an environment where who you are and what you achieve is not recognized or rewarded, if it's overlooked, if you aren't given additional opportunities or autonomy or the opportunity to work on your own project, if you don't have that, it's going to be hard to basically do your best work. Because there's an argument, at least from Herzberg, that doing your best work is also, doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's more than you kind of powering through. It is that you are surrounded and supported, and that without those things in place, you can try to sort of power through, and in many cases you can succeed, but it's like the difference between having the wind in your face versus the wind sort of pushing you at your back. And so actually prioritizing being in a lab or being in a work environment where you feel that you are seen and heard and supported is key. It's key. The interesting thing about it, and the final kind of point that I do think is interesting, is that when you think about, well, who is responsible or who can actually sort of shape all of these supports, the PI becomes so critical. The PI is central. They are the ones who determine salary. They are the ones who actually decide if they're going to renew your funding. They are the ones who basically set the culture in the lab. They are the ones who basically determine not just your relationship with them, but also what interactions in the lab are like. They are the ones who actually have a say in terms of whether or not, as I said before, if you get advanced, if you get recognized, if you have authorship, if you have autonomy to work on your own project. That the relationship with the PI is so key. And so I know that we spent a good deal of time actually thinking about what's going on for you, but when we talk about being curious about what's going on for your PI and what you're looking for in a good fit environment, it starts to become clear that not only are you interested and curious about what their needs are, what their preferences and what their values are, but you start to appreciate how important sort of who they are as a person, their sense of how they make decisions, and how much power and influence they have in terms of affecting your ability to succeed or fail. The final two things that I'll sort of say about this, when we look a little bit closer at what's going on for a PI, is the following. That one of the interesting things about your mentor, and it is a concept within the sciences that, that your PI is your mentor. In some cases, it's not even sort of like you don't even necessarily get a choice. But the way that we conceptualize it is that your PI is not just a mentor, they're a research mentor, which is a special type of mentor. We call them like a super mentor. They've got these overlapping mentoring, educational, training, and supervisory responsibilities. In that, one of the things that you start to realize, or one of the things that perhaps Diego and Mia would realize, is that they have a relationship with their PI which involves, say, a mentoring role, where there's an expectation of, say, career development support or psychosocial support. They may have a relationship which actually involves a training sort of interaction, in that the PI at least is responsible, if not for directly teaching, for facilitating the teaching in terms of prioritizing postdocs, for example, focusing on teaching grad students the skills that they need to develop as a scientist, including developing your scientific knowledge, teaching technical skills, developing your scientific thinking, developing your scientific leadership skills. And then your PI also has this third role. This role actually is focused not just on your productivity, but also on the overall productivity in the lab. And the reason why this is important is because your mentor, your research mentor, your PI happens to have these three roles. One of the interesting things that you need to shift when you're conceptualizing what your relationship is with your PI is that with your mentor, you have conversations. But with your supervisor, the person who's actually interested in managing your productivity, who needs you to be a certain, to maintain or get to a certain level of productivity, you don't really have conversations. You have negotiations. The way to explain this is to talk a little bit more about what was going on for Mia. So Mia and Pri have spoken about Mia's academic career path several times, but Mia has actually never shared her interest in possibly pursuing an industry career, even though it's important to her, because she's never been sure about how Pri would react. And because she knows that Pri has a strong commitment to mentoring emerging scientists into faculty careers, and she doesn't want to let her down. She also, in addition to not necessarily wanting to let her down, she realizes that throughout her her training, that one of the reasons why she didn't choose to actually be incredibly transparent about it was that she was concerned about how Pri, who has the ability to allocate resources or to assign projects, how Pri would respond. And because she wasn't sure how she would respond, Mia chose not to share that information. And so one of the things that ends up happening with your relationship with your PI is that sometimes you have a relationship where you're not quite sure sort of who you're talking to today. So if you've ever been in a situation where you have felt that there's something that you couldn't share with your PI, that is probably because of the role conflict. While on the one hand, your PI actually says that, or actually they may define themselves as a mentor, you may actually at least be consciously or unconsciously aware that they also have this role and this they also have these needs for a certain level of productivity in the lab. And because of that, realizing that you need to choose a lab where not only you can sort of bring yourself to work, but also you can be in a situation where your PI is willing to negotiate with you, that they're willing to, and by that, it means that they're willing to be clear about what level of expectation or what level of productivity they need to see from you, what projects they need you to work on for their productivity. And at the same time, you're able to negotiate with them what things that you would like to achieve with your time that actually sets you up for success. The idea is that if your PI didn't also have this, if your productivity didn't actually impact their productivity, you would be able to be very candid. But because they have this role conflict, sometimes it's a role conflict, but they have these multiple roles. Choosing a PI who is willing to bring their full selves to work, as in they're willing to acknowledge that they have a mentoring role, they're willing to acknowledge that there is training that needs to be done, they're willing to acknowledge that they actually are interested in your productivity goals, but they also have productivity goals, and they're willing to actually negotiate with you about it, is key. I have talked to a number of PIs who actually sort of see themselves entirely as mentors. And they'll say things like, my door is always open. I don't understand why people aren't walking through the door. And then they'll actually slightly pathologize on the student by suggesting that they're not willing to take the initiative. They're not willing to step up and say something. And in some cases, yes, you know what? Perhaps you might actually sort of feel that you can associate sort of your feelings with maybe imposter syndrome. But I want to be clear that this isn't about just you personally. This is also about sort of just realizing that there's a systemic issue, that your PI is also responsible for thinking about all the productivity in the lab. And if you are engaged in activities and you're concerned that they won't actually find them beneficial or productive, those activities won't be welcome or rewarded, then yes, it is a strategic thing for you to do, to think about when is the best time for you to share this information and how you're going to share it. But it also becomes key for you to have a high level of certainty that you are choosing an environment where you can actually have these conversations. Now, the final thing I'll just share is that there's some people who think, well, you know what? No lab, no PI, or no research experience is perfect. So, I mean, does it really matter that I really actually focus not just on the science, but also on the PI? And the answer is yes. Not just because your PI happens to have their own needs and preferences and values, but also because of the difference in the power differential between you and your PI. Now, people talk about power differentials all the time, but I find it's really helpful to apply it to a model. And for that, I am a huge fan of the model by two social psychologists named John French and Bertram Raven. Raven and French were basically trying to actually figure out if you could categorize different types of power, right? Like when you basically say that somebody's more powerful than you, what makes them more powerful than you? And they were able to do it. And what they basically defined was that there were 6 bases of power. I'm going to go through them. They're not going to make much sense. I'm going to then apply them to Mia and Diego, and you are going to totally understand. So the 6 bases of power are legitimate, referent, expertise, reward and coercion, and information. Think of it like a little power rainbow. But to break down what that means is that legitimate means that you basically have formal authority. So for example, your PI has a title, they're an associate professor, or they happen to be a chair. And so when you're thinking about what legitimate authority is, it means that the person actually has the community that they're in recognizes that they have certain rights and powers. The second is reference, as in the person's referent is in that the person's reputation. That the easiest way to think about it is that if something happened, who would be believed and who would be protected? Referent means a person's reputation, which actually is related to their perceived worthiness and right to others' respect. Expertise is pretty obvious, a person's level of knowledge and skill in a particular area. Reward and coercion is also pretty clear, a person's ability to reward people for doing what they want, and also your ability to punish people for not doing what you want. And the final one is information, a person's ability to control access to the knowledge that somebody needs to accomplish something. Now, usually by this point, students' eyes glaze over until I do this. The thing that you need to understand is that each of the 6 bases of power more naturally lie on the side of the PI in a research mentoring relationship. That everything from the tenure, the title, their reputation, from their scientific knowledge and skills, from their ability to hire or promote or fire you, the resources that they have access to and their decision to give it to you or withhold it from you. If you're going into a faculty career, you are thinking about what work you can take, but even if you're not, you need a letter of recommendation. That sometimes when you feel that you are having a difficult relationship with your PI, it's because you are astutely and acutely aware of the power differential. Now, for Mia and Diego, the way that this looks is the following. So say they both went to have a postdoc in a lab, and the PI woke up one day and said, "You misunderstood. You are not first author on this paper." It is true that the student or the postdoc would actually have agency. But when you look at what they have to do, including perhaps even as graduate students, they would probably go to their thesis committee to basically get advice. They might actually reach out to another faculty member or another mentor outside the institution for advice and support. They might actually check in with the ombuds for coaching because they realize that they're not quite sure what happened and they don't necessarily know how to have the conversation with their PI. They may actually start to think about the fact that they need to find their own funding, and they may actually think about whether or not in their career path, if they could find other letters of recommendation. And they may be in a situation where they actually kept records of meetings and emails and documents and agreements regarding their paper and authorship. But the main thing you need to understand is that a power differential is the amount of difference in time and energy that it takes for you to protect yourself. And so when you think about this question about a PI, or the person, your PI, saying that they misunderstood, that took 5 seconds. But all of the actions that you would have to engage in, that may take 5 weeks, that may take 5 months. You may never actually be able to do it. And then you sort of imagine that when you're thinking about a relationship with your PI, that is just one decision, but that you basically are in a situation where almost every decision that they make, almost everything that they communicate, almost every sort of change that they need to manage, including someone leaving or somebody needing to advance, or if there's a conflict in the lab, do they handle it or do they not handle it? That the reason why you're honoring the idea that you have preferences and needs and values is important is because once you realize that your PI also happens to have interests, needs, and values, you need to be curious about where they overlap and don't overlap, because the relationship has just such disparity. It isn't always the case, right? Like if you aren't necessarily in an academic position, you can just leave the job. But because that training relationship is just so uniquely designed, you have to choose a relationship with someone that you trust. And so to bring it all home, because the PI is so instrumental to your training and the launching of your own career, because they wield so much power, and because the decisions and support or the lack thereof is so central to sustaining or deflating your own motivation, well-being, and productivity, the strategic postdoc is one who prioritizes finding a PI who owns each of their roles, who acknowledges that that there are times when your interest and your needs and your values overlap and times when they don't, and is willing to negotiate with you. And also is actively cultivating a lab based on qualities such as civility, transparency, collegiality. And so when we think about the students who are most successful, in the end, they don't just seek a postdoc, they're seeking a PI, one who they feel that they can work with, one who they feel that they not just respect as a scientist, but that they can trust as an individual. In the end, the way to think about it is this, that the first step of being able to basically negotiate all of the hundreds of decisions or thousands of kind of things that will need to be negotiated, both with the PI that you are with your PhD advisor who you're leaving and with a PI who you're going towards, is that you first need to accept what's essential to your well-being and productivity and what your preferences are and what your values are. And you need to understand and appreciate that your PI also has needs, preferences, and values. And then you need to feel that you are actually able to negotiate with them. Throughout some of our other series, we will be focusing on very sort of pragmatic, practical things like how to interview or how to scout a lab. And those, I think, for a number of people feel really easy to do, or they feel easier to do than this first step, which is really trying to take time to reflect and acknowledge that taking time to think about your preferences, needs, and values are important. So I just wanted to end by talking about what you do next. The first is that you just need to be authentic. You need to actually acknowledge that there's an important relationship between your preferences, needs, and values and your professional success. The second is you need to be curious. You need to prioritize and assess your potential PIs, not just their science, their reputation, their funding, but their abilities, track record, and values as a mentor, an educator, and a supervisor. And understand that it is the basis of your next 1,000 conversations, negotiations, communications, conflicts, and whatever change is going to happen. There is this piece about also being self-aware about both the internal and external barriers and factors that are influencing how you make decisions and communicate and manage change and handle conflict. And that's to say that for some people, actually doing this work of thinking about what's important to you feels really uncomfortable. And so I encourage you to see if there are any sort of mentor support or a career office at your institution or in your professional associations to actually help support you as you do this important work. So the final part of this is to be proactive. And so if you do ultimately choose a postdoc that you don't necessarily have a high level of confidence, that you can actually develop a functional working relationship with your PI. If it's the only postdoc that you have, it may be the case that you actually take the postdoc. But then the question is, what agency do you have in that moment? And the idea is that you can still be proactive in thinking about ways to develop support around you. That includes things like finding allies, developing and documenting and sharing a development plan, not just with your PI, but with others in the lab. And then finally, this idea that basically says that you are going to seek out and reach out to those allies and for help and support and advice at the first sign of any concerns that you have. And the final part is pacing yourself to develop strategies that protect your well-being. One of the neat things that a student I worked with said that it said that she did was that she said that actually sort of engaging in a negotiation with her PI was actually a little bit stressful for her. And so the way that she sort of handled it was that she intentionally, something like 30 minutes beforehand, chose to do something that she found enjoyable, like read a book or have a cup of tea. And then she intentionally didn't schedule anything for at least an hour to 2 hours afterwards so she could decompress. And so I just thought that that was just a really kind of thoughtful and astute about thinking about what she needed to be able to navigate that situation. And most importantly, she didn't gaslight herself and tell herself that she ought to just get over it or that she didn't know why she feels this way. It's this sense of really kind of honoring how you function best and how you work best that is at the center of basically choosing a career path and living a professional life that is healthy, that it's functional, and that is rewarding. So that is all the information that we usually share when we are talking with students about why acknowledging your preferences, your needs, and your values are important. Thank you.